Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started, but people can join whenever they can. We're just gonna start off with a quick introduction. So, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation on anthropology and conservation. My name is Lauren Smith, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, there are a few rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we very much greatly appreciate you taking the time to fill this out. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Tim Sefczek, who earned his PhD in primatology from Ohio State University, where he studied behavioral ecology of aye-aye, a nocturnal lemur species. He completed his postdoc at Omaha's Henry-Doorly Zoo and Aquarium, where he continued his work in Madagascar, focusing on the conservation and research of various endangered species of lemurs. He is currently a lecturer of biological anthropology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln School of Integrative Global Studies. I created this event because I personally had Dr. Sefczek as a professor for a course titled fittingly Anthropology and Conservation, which I still think about often. So I'm especially excited for you all to experience his expertise tonight. With that, I'll let him take it away, and please welcome Dr. Tim Sefczek.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren, and thank you for Conservation Nebraska for having me to come and talk to you guys. So yeah, as Lauren mentioned, my work is mainly in Madagascar. And I don't know, you probably are familiar with this, but Madagascar and Nebraska are pretty different. So I'm going to pull in a couple of examples from Madagascar to try and help make some of the points that I want to talk about. But we're going to try and mostly focus on some of the different conservation works that are happening in Nebraska and how we can take an anthropological perspective on how those are working. And before I start, I really want to talk about just what conservation means, because for a lot of different people, conservation has different meanings. So we have one aspect, which is the preservation ethic. And this is really what I was taught with, this idea that we need to conserve nature. Nature needs to be retained and maintained as it is and not really interfered with and not have too much disturbance from people, and just let it kind of be how it is. But there's other individuals who are trained under a different ethic, which is called the resource conservation ethic. And from that perspective, and for those people, conservation is more about the use of resources, how we can maximize the use, and how we can minimize waste of those resources in a way that not only benefits present populations, but also future populations moving forward. So in essence, trying to get the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people over the longest period of time. So there's a lot of different perspectives at play when we start talking about conservation and what exactly it means. Now, more recently, we're starting to recognize that humans are a part of nature, and we can't really distinguish and separate ourselves from nature. And what we're doing currently to our environment is going to have repercussions back on us because we are an integral part of it, and it is an ecological community that humans are a component of. So there's a real interest now in trying to maintain the health and the safety of human populations. And in order to do that, we're trying to maintain the health of the ecosystem. And of course, when we fail to do that, we're seeing how these problems are getting exacerbated and they're getting larger. So Hurricane Ian in 2020, devastating storm. We had the Yellowstone floods in 2024, and we had the LA wildfires most recently. So these problems are becoming more and more frequent and becoming more and more grand in scale, unfortunately. So what exactly does anthropology add to the conversation? because conservation biology already in itself is a multidisciplinary approach, and there's a lot of different facets in play and a lot of different parties bringing different things to the table. And the anthropology, which is way down in the bottom corner there, its main part is to focus on the human element of conservation. What exactly do humans do? How do we play into this really delicate balance? And in particular, I want to focus on three areas of anthropology and what kind of questions it can bring to conservation biology. The first one is questions about dynamics of power. The second thing is this idea of wild and what we consider wild. And then the last thing is how we create and produce identity through conservation work. So we're going to start, first of all, with the dynamics of power, because conservation, if anything else, it's always kind of been this flex of power and who has control and who can have control over certain spaces or over certain species or even over other people. The earliest example of this would probably be in, royal forests, where royal populations are setting aside lands, designating them as private spaces that only certain individuals have access to. And common populations were not allowed into those spaces, were not allowed to remove resources from the forest because they just didn't have the power to do so. They were being restricted from that area. And when we look through time, that's kind of how early conservation starts. But not so much necessarily how it plays out now. We don't really have as many, royal elite populations that are necessarily dictating the rules, but we do still see situations of some groups having control or flexing power over other groups. And this can be political groups, it can be cultural groups. We see instances of people being displaced or forcibly removed, and even modifications of significant lands. So an example of this would be with Mount Rushmore. That particular area in the Black Hills was home to the Lakota people. That space was a sacred space for them, the Tunkasila Sakpe Paha, and Lakota were forcibly removed, and their sacred place was changed to be Mount Rushmore. So again, we see different situations where power dynamics are in play. So talk a little bit about Madagascar before I go into more of Nebraska work. So some of the organizations that I had the great pleasure of working with were Madagascar Biodiversity Partnership, which was founded and run by Dr. Edward Lewis, who is based out of Bellevue, Nebraska. And his wife Susie Lewis runs Conservation Fusion. And these two organizations were fantastic at trying to get people more integrated, trying to get people more involved in the conservation work that is in their immediate area. Very much similar to Conservation Nebraska, trying to get people involved in what's happening in their neighborhood. They went about this in slightly different ways. So Madagascar Biodiversity Partnership, which I'm going to call MVP for short because it's a lot easier to say. One of their big projects was reforestation, and they were really heavy on incentivizing the reforestation work that people did, trying to give them a little bit of a paycheck for it, trying to give them credit for planting trees. This way, they're building some sort of ownership over the land and having this feeling of power and control over the spaces that they're working in, rather than feeling like they're being dictated what to do. And it works in a lot of ways. These people were very much attached to the forest, were actively patrolling these spaces and reporting any times that there were fires, and then going out and reforesting if they needed to. Conservation Fusion took a different approach. They are education oriented, and so they worked with the children and some of the local population, trying to get them a little bit more engaged with their local forests, with the local wildlife, giving them opportunities to experience the animals in their own backyard when they normally might not be able to. And again, the whole idea is this sense of pride and this sense of ownership over the species that they are directly connected with and literally right next to. And one of the great stories that comes out of some of this work is in Kianjavatu, which is a village in southeastern Madagascar. Kianjavatu is home to a handful of different lemur species. It is a heavily disturbed forest, lots of secondary growth, lots of human disturbance and interaction and harvesting of some of the plants. But there are several species that do well there. And one of them is the greater bamboo lemur, which is what you see imaged on the left. Greater bamboo lemur is a critically endangered species. And during part of the year, when the greater bamboo lemurs have their infants and the infants are suckling and they're nursing and developing, the bamboo lemurs are very reliant on, at that point, bamboo. They eat other things, but that particular time of year, bamboo becomes important to their diet. But at that same time, the local population is in need of bamboo because they use it as a resource to make baskets so that they can start collecting lychee fruit to sell so that they have some sort of income. So we end up getting this competition between the lemur and the human populations over this one resource. And ultimately, the lemur is the one that's going to lose those. And in this particular instance, those greater bamboo lemurs had very low infant survival rate because of this. And I think it was lower than 50% of the infants were making it through that season. Well, the mayor of Kianjavatu, recognizing the tourism industry that is kind of growing around this critically endangered species, recognizing the jobs that are created for, taking care of, protecting these species, also realized that this was becoming a problem. And completely on his own accord, without prompting from any of the organizations in the area, he starts to set aside parcels of land and say, during these seasons, we're not going to harvest from these spaces. And we're going to have specific designated areas where you can get a permit and you can harvest from. And what they found was during that year that they did that, the bamboo lemur infant survival rate was upwards of, I think, between 80 and 90%. It was incredibly high compared to what it used to be. And so they had so much success with that, and people were still able to get the resources they need, that they were expanding the program, and we're going to start incorporating other spaces as completely protected and other places where they were going to be able to let people harvest some of the bamboo. So this is an example, again, where you have kind of this power dynamic in play where some of the government agencies are trying to help control some of the spaces, but balance it out in a way where people are still able to access resources and the bamboo lemurs are not necessarily getting harmed as much. So what about in Nebraska? In Nebraska, we have a couple of different things going on. One of the big ones that I pulled from was an article by Fogarty et al. In 2020. And they identified one of the major problems facing Nebraska as the loss of grasslands. In the Great Plains, we're seeing a lot of the grasslands being lost to woody cover, a lot of trees growing and dispersing and taking over this space and basically outcompeting the grasses so that we no longer have grasslands. And the research found that between 2000 and 2017, woody cover managed to increase by about 250,000 hectares, which is about 2.3% of the landscape of the grasslands. And they were projecting forward that if that rate continues, we just completely lose all the grasslands that we had. So the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, among others, was very interested in trying to make sure that we don't lose this unique landscape. And so they started trying to find different ways to help manage this, prevent some of the spread of these woody covers, and find other partners that they could work with to achieve this goal. And what they found was the best option for trying to control the woody growth and maintain grasslands was to do prescribed burns, because the burns not only destroyed the trees, it also destroyed the seeds that were waiting to sprout, and it promoted the growth, or it stimulated the growth of the natural grasslands. And the most success that they've had so far has been in the Los Canyon area, where there was actually, or there is, I should say, a coalition of landowners who are working actively with Nebraska Game and Parks to do prescribed burns consistently. And in that particular region, they're seeing, if not a stabilization, a decline in the woody coverage that is occurring. So they're able to maintain the grasslands in that space, and they're hoping that they can continue to do this in other locations across Nebraska as well. But this is an example of how these individuals, both the organization and the individual landowners or these different agents, are finding ways to work together, share that power dynamic, and find a solution that works for multiple inclusive stakeholders in the area. Now, one of the big issues that Nebraska could potentially face is just the amount of private land ownership in the state. The upper right image is from the World Herald article in 2021 that shows how much of the land is owned, or how much private farmland is owned by Bill Gates, which is over 20,000 acres, which is a lot for one person to own. And the graphic on the left shows how much of the total area of Nebraska is actually federally owned land, which means the vast majority of it is privately owned land. Now, in article by Zhang et al. 2022, they were talking about conservation easements, which is a way for individuals to work with organizations to purchase land that they then own, but they also kind of follow restrictions in terms of trying to protect the land and use it in certain ways and make sure that they stay within guidelines for how that easement is going to work. And it turns out that private lands are actually a very important part of conservation work, because somewhere around 95%, maybe even over 95% of the federally listed species that we have are occupying private lands, which means that we are basically in a situation where we have to work with certain individuals in order to achieve conservation goals. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that those power dynamics that are in play are very much going to be controlled by a handful of individuals, and it's not going to be conservation involvement across the board necessarily. We're going to be playing to certain desires more than others potentially. And again, I'm not trying to say that some people are bad actors. It's just the nature of the situation. You're not going to get equal opportunity involvement in conservation work for everyone. But this is one of the big areas for anthropology that I think can contribute to conservation, is because a lot of the times when we think about conservation work, we think about who's going to be hurt, who are the, for lack of a better term, who are the losers in the conservation work, who's most at risk, and what are some of the negative consequences that we could suffer. But anthropology is not just interested in that. We're also interested in who would we consider the conservation winners, who are in a situation to benefit, and what kind of ideas, what kind of power dynamics are going to be in play that they would want to enforce, or that they are going to benefit most from, and how that could potentially hurt other people simultaneously. So it's not just from one perspective, it's again kind of seeing where all of those different players stand. Another example of this we can see in land acknowledgements. This is a more recent phenomenon where we're seeing indigenous populations being recognized, at least in some sort of language, for their historical presence in an area. But this really didn't do too much. It didn't really acknowledge kind of the dark history that surrounded a lot of these habitats, that surrounded a lot of the landscape, and that what happened to the indigenous populations that used to live in that area. And so in 2021, the Association for Indigenous Americans requested that a pause would be put on the land acknowledgement grants. And it was a little bit of a surprise for some people, but the explanation was that even though it starts a nice conversation, it really doesn't do much to benefit these native tribes. And it was really seen as more of a, opportunity to feel good about how you're doing, kind of an empty gesture, but hey, I'm trying. And so they asked a multitude of groups, including the American Anthropological Association, to work with Indigenous American populations to help improve these statements and to make them more actionable. And a great example of this is with Creighton University's Cultural and Social Studies Department. They are actively working with the Omaha population to try and make that land acknowledgement not only phrased properly, but also something that is actionable, that can have some sort of consequences or ability to improve the situation for the Omaha people. All right, the second idea is, or the second concept that I want to talk about in terms of what anthropology can bring to the table, is this idea of wild. What is wild? And anthropologists are interested in questions like, where does the idea of wild come from? And how does it influence our conservation strategies, right? What exactly makes the bison wild, but the squirrel in our own backyard not wild, or maybe at best kind of wild adjacent? Um, I'm not necessarily going to go into these two species in particular, but you get the idea in terms of we kind of designate wild or wilderness or this natural idea to certain species or to certain landscapes and exclude it from others. And we can expand this concept to even exotic or invasive species, which are often seen as a problem or a nuisance population. But if we stop and think about their behavior, just because they're not native to the area doesn't mean that what they're doing, what their behaviors are not natural, and doesn't mean that the subsequent impact to the spaces are not natural as well. It's just not necessarily what we want to see. So going back to Ranamafan, or sorry, going back to Madagascar, and looking specifically at Ranamafan National Park. This is a national park that was created in the 1980s. And one of the major reasons that this park was created was because it had a population of those greater bamboo lemurs. Um, in the 1980s, there weren't many of them known. We didn't have many locations where we actively could see them. And in Ranamafan, you see that little white dot that says Tala. Tala Tekeli is a small forest in that larger national park that was actively logged and had a lot of human disturbance and had, people removing resources from it and whatnot. And they decided, when they built this national park to help protect this endangered species, they decided that they were going to prohibit all harvesting, all logging. We were going to let this forest grow and develop, and we were going to let the species be, very much in the preservation ethic idea. Unfortunately, what happened is, where that population used to be, which was Chiatan did a study in 1999 on two different groups with about 15 individuals total. The population was relatively healthy, relatively stable. Now, 30 years later, that population is down to, specifically in Tala Tekeli, I should say, that population is down to two individuals, a male and his daughter. So it's not even a viable population. Now there are other greater bamboo lemurs distributed on the edges of the park, but not really in the central area of Tala Tekeli, Vatuluka, Vaturanana, where most of the tourists come. Meanwhile, down the road at MBP's site at Kianjavatu, we again mentioned the fact that this was a heavily disturbed forest, lots of secondary growth, and that's the image that you see in the bottom right. You can see some of those traveler palms and stuff. Those are indications of a forest that's seen some disturbance. It's seen things. 40 minutes down the road from Ranamafan, there's at least 30, I think maybe upwards of 60 individuals. I might be off on that number, but at least 30 individuals in this forest, and they're doing very well. They're very healthy. And so what we think is happening, and right now we're trying to work on proving this and finding the science to back this up. But what we think is happening is that this species might be one of those that is a specialist on edge habitats or disturbed habitats. And when Ranamafan National Park was created and that forest parcel Tala Tekeli was left alone and left to become more of an old growth forest, at least maybe 40 years later, old, not a true old growth, but as it was allowed to grow and develop, it became less hospitable, less suitable for this primate species. And so our perceptions of what is natural, what is wild, letting this forest grow and develop and change ultimately led to the detriment of the species because that's not what it needed. Um, it was very counteractive in terms of what was healthy for the forest for that particular species. Other species are doing very well because of it. This particular critically endangered one, not so much. So flipping back to Nebraska, talking about wild and wilderness. This is an image on the left of University Hall at UNL in the mid 1800s. And the image on the right is of Lincoln now, or at least close to now. And beyond just the urban sprawl, because obviously there's been an increase in the housing and the buildings and development and whatnot, what I want you to notice is the increase in trees. And even if you look off towards the horizon, it's just a lot of trees. And we see the same thing happening in other parts of Nebraska as well. This is bottom right is a picture of Nebraska City, the Arbor Day Farm, or sorry, excuse me, Arbor Day Farm Lodge. And the upper left picture is from the 1800s of Wyoming, Nebraska, which is just outside of Nebraska City, when the Mormons were passing through that area. And again, you can see a very big difference in the landscape, forested, not forested. So where did all these trees come from? And why are there so many trees, right? That's not what used to be there. And there's this kind of I believe that in part, and I'll talk about this in a little bit on the next slide as well. There's this idea that trees are nature, and nature needs trees to really be natural. And indeed, if we look at Nebraska today and what some of the activities that are happening, the Nebraska statewide Arboretum was actually awarded $10 million in 2024 by the USDA Forest Service through the Urban and Community Forestry Program. And the objective is to distribute grants to improve Nebraska's community forest infrastructure with the main goal of improving Nebraska's community forest canopy. And again, I would point to that image in the 1800s and say, what forest structure? But that's where we are today, is this desire to develop some forests in some areas, but again, not necessarily in the grasslands where they're becoming problematic. So this really brings me to kind of the last point with the anthropological work, is the creation and production of identity. And I say last point, but I'm still going to be talking for a while, so I apologize. But when we start talking about conservation, the reality is that we conserve what we want to see. We conserve the space that we imagine it to be or that we want it to be. At this point, I'm going to spend most of the rest of the talk focused on Nebraska itself. There is still obviously work going on in Madagascar, but it's still very much kind of in fledgling phases and trying to get off the ground in some respects. So I don't really have great examples of identity creation there. I hit a little bit on it with Aronimafon National Park, of course, but we're going to focus mostly on Nebraska. So, pulling from an article by Joel Orth in 2011, he describes how post-Civil War, the Great Plains was seen as an empty space, and it was also called the Great American Desert. And it was identified as a place where we wanted to actively transform and improve the landscape. And depending on who you talk to, different people had different perceptions of what they wanted that space to be. So, cattle ranchers, for instance, imagine the space to be a great location to raise cattle and maybe get rid of some of those free roaming bison. Farmers, on the other hand, obviously wanted to do agriculture, or even foresters would have wanted to see forested spaces in those areas. In general, we wanted to see better places for homesteading, maybe a bit more stable farming communities where people could thrive. And, you know, if we're going to have people thriving, we need to be able to have an active production of food. And so the Great Plains was seen as a difficult place to do that and to create agriculture because it just didn't have very predictable rainfall. And at the time, in the early 1900s, there was what I will for now call science that suggested that trees and forests actually improved rainfall in the area, or at the very least would be able to break some wind to prevent not erosion, but evaporation of rainfall to keep the land a little bit more moist. And so there was kind of this big push to see more forests occurring in Nebraska. Got Madagascar on the brain now. See more forests occurring in Nebraska and along the Great Plains to help with predictable rainfall. And one of the big proponents of foresting Nebraska was a botanist at UNL named Charles Bessey. And his argument was that, well, look, we have fossilized trees in the area. So clearly there used to be forests in places like northern, central, and western Nebraska. And he said that the reason that we don't have them anymore is because lightning strikes would ultimately cause forest fires that would destroy them. And then the bison would come through and trample any of the saplings that would try and grow. And the indigenous American populations would repeatedly burn the landscape, thus destroying any potential trees to grow as well. And so his idea was, if we stop the forest fires, if we remove the bison, and if we remove those indigenous populations, we should be able to grow forests. And so they started planting trees and they started working on that. And we now today have the largest man-made forest in the Western Hemisphere at the Nebraska National Forest. Is it supposed to be there? Not going to say yes or no on that one. But we can clearly see in this particular instance where the economic, the political, and the cultural rationales for the conservation-oriented work were very much in play over the choices that were made. And a lot of the times when we talk about conservation, we need to be careful about which stakeholders are being involved, which stakeholders are having a say in terms of the production, the creation, and the preservation of the landscape and of the animals in that space. Now, one of the things as an anthropologist that I like to point out is wherever humans go, for as long as we've been around, we've always caused a huge change to occur. We are agents of change. And I would argue that one of our greatest abilities or one of our greatest adaptations is our ability to modify our environment to make it better suit our needs. Now, there is a ecological anthropologist by the name of Anna Tsing, and she's done multiple papers, but in one of them, she talks about weed species. And she says a weed species is one that takes advantage of new niches. And they're weeds because they're creatures of disturbance, and they'll climb over other things and they'll form collaboration with other organisms so that they can better proliferate. And in that same chapter, she says that by definition, if we think about humans, humans are a weed species. That is what we do. And if we look at the start of human culture, and in particular modern human culture, we can trace that back to the origins of agriculture. And agriculture itself was humans creating a collaboration with weeds. We had certain areas that we were occupying in, little villages and stuff like that. And we would modify the landscape a little bit. And in that modified landscape, weeds would grow up around us. And this is what we assume how agriculture starts. Weeds grow up around us, and the ones that produce some sort of resource that we can take advantage of, we keep and we make more prolific. And by making them more prolific, we're making ourselves more prolific. And that's really how our settlements start and how our population grows. And if we look at human populations and we look at the plants that we use, there's very much a correlation between which plants are used, where they occur, and where humans occur. So we actually start by cultivating weeds and modifying our landscapes. What's ironic is how much our perception of weeds has changed now, though, because whenever we manipulate the environment, there's always going to be species that can take advantage of the new ecological niches that we create. And if we look at modern agriculture, we can see how our feelings towards weed species, again, the agricultural species that we use now, we don't consider weeds, but the weed species that we have a problem with, weeds have really changed in our opinion. And we're now trying to preserve the landscape in a way that we identify with, in a way that helps us maintain our identity and helps us improve our situation. So if you look at Nebraska now. The two main crops in Nebraska are corn, which is in the light green, and soybean, which is in the dark green. And there are a couple of articles, there's multiple articles on this. I picked out two, one from Sarangi and Jahala in 2018, and one from Oliveira and colleagues in 2019. Both of those are very much focused on farmers' activities towards controlling weeds. One of them was looking at weeds and which ones were the most common and what are some of the management practices that farmers use to control them. And the other one, the second one, the Oliveira and colleagues, was looking at cover crops that farmers used and why they used cover crops. And the main reasons were for increased production on their land and to prevent weed species. And so the focus is really on avoiding weeds and maintaining the space as it currently is, or at the very least, maximizing the yield of the space. And weeds are seen as something that's undesirable and going to prevent us from doing that. And they're organisms that we feel like need to be controlled. And they need to be controlled because they don't fit into our ideal space, our ideal landscape, whether that be an agricultural field or whether that's in a personal garden as well. I'm sure many of you out there probably have situations where you're tired of weeding, and we're coming close to that season, right? But what about in Nebraska's wild spaces? What about in the areas where we see landscapes or habitats that are retained for their aesthetics or for their quality of life, their general quality of nature? Well, if we look at our wild places, they actually demonstrate very well humans' ability to adapt and manipulate their environment for our own benefit. And we can see this across the United States, where humans have modified the landscape, especially in the case of using prescribed burning on cultural lands to be able to achieve, an increase in resource consumption. So in Northern California, in the tan bark oak groves, we had the Yurok, the Karok, and the Hupa tribes doing regular burns. And the regular burns would help promote the acorn harvests that they would use to help sustain their populations. It would also reduce conifers, it would reduce pest species, and it would reduce diseases in the area. In the Appalachian forests in the east, we see similar things happening with prescribed burns used to promote oak and chestnut tree growth, which again promotes the desired nut crops that they would use, and it reduces the amount of conifers that might be in the area. On the Great Plains, it might seem like a little bit of a different story because we don't really have the same kind of forest structure. But Roos and colleagues in 2018 had a great study that showed that even in the Great Plains, you had indigenous American tribes that would actively burn the landscape in order to make bison more manageable. Right. They figured out that bison seemed to prefer grazing in recently burned patches. And so they would actively practice burning in certain spaces to make the bison move where they wanted them to so that they could increase the encounter rate with this species. And so if we stop and think about some of those earlier problems, particularly the wildfires that we are now experiencing, and how those are often, we know that those are due to the fact that we don't do those prescribed burns anymore, and we let the vegetation and the dead vegetation build up. A lot of that has roots in our past and current perceptions of what is and is not natural, right? Fire was seen as a not natural thing, but the landscapes that it was creating were considered natural. And so our actions are either our actions in large part were considered apart from nature or separate from nature and not really part of what was going on in the landscape. And the other bit of this that we see end up playing out is that where conservation work happens, because we have this idea of wild and we have this identity that we want to create around wilderness, we often don't see urban spaces or developed spaces as natural. And they have a different perspective on where the conservation work should be done. And when we have this separation of natural nature and culture, nature is seen as an area of hardship or maybe even an area of catastrophes. And there's this feeling of people needing to master it, either controlling it, which is maybe a little more of a past cultural thing, or managing it and preserving it. But if we look at all the kind of terms that go with conservation, with management and enrichment and cultivation, all of it is humans controlling the space, right? It is human power over the space that we are trying to conserve. This also then means that, well, humans now have control over a space, but there are also humans that are going to be the bad guys. And we start assigning identities to individuals who are in that area. Whether, I shouldn't say whether, because real nature is not considered to be in city spaces, urban populations don't consider themselves to be in a natural environment. And when we look at rural populations, we consider them maybe encroaching on the natural environment. And so this automatically creates a conflict of interest and creates these power dynamics, particularly when you talk about, maybe organizations that have a little bit more political pull or marginalized populations who might be on the outskirts. And we see these conflicting spaces of people trying to play out their perceived identity of what nature is in a space. All right, last bit I want to talk about here is the sandhill cranes, since we just kind of finished that season. Because I think the sandhill cranes kind of nicely show us a combination of these three things: what we consider wild, how power dynamics play out, and how our identity is formed around either a space or a species. So, um, I was looking around trying to find find a couple of things with specific to Nebraska, and one of the pieces that I found for Nebraska is the Nebraska Nature Legacy Project, which is very much dedicated to conservation work in Nebraska. And the goals of the Nebraska Nature Legacy Project are threefold: to reverse the decline of at-risk species, to recover listed species so that they can achieve delisting, and to keep common species common. There's a part of me that has a conflict in here where it's like, well, if you change the environment or maintain the environment for one, it's going to be difficult to not do something to the other one. Again, whenever you make a change, it's going to influence something else. But beside that point, what I really want to focus on is a species like the sandhill crane and how it fits into this narrative. Because if we stop and think about the sandhill crane, Nebraska is part of their migration route. We are a stopover spot. And granted, it is a huge stopover spot. Somewhere around 500,000 sandhill cranes every year use Nebraska on their way to the nesting grounds. But this also means that this is not a native species, not in the sense of something that is here constantly and always using this space. It is literally just passing through the area. It's a transient entity. And yet, since 2009, we've seen programs like, if not longer, we've seen programs like the Nature Conservancy using tools like prescribed burns and different management practices or grazing practices to try and control forest encroachment on these spaces and maintain the landscape the way it is, so that it can promote and maintain this transition zone, I guess is the best way to put it, for the sandhill cranes. Now, simultaneously, while we're doing that, while we're trying to keep the landscape the way it is for this species, they also acknowledge in their video that about 90% of the sandhill crane diet while they're here is corn, which is also not a native species. So we're already in this space now where we're conserving for a species that isn't really native, isn't really here all the time, with a food source that isn't really native. It is here all the time, I'll give it that, but it isn't really native. So given that farmlands are occupying some of the territory, and the management of the landscape is to maintain the migration of this transient bird species, is it really a wild space? Is this a wild area? And maybe more importantly is, do we really think that this species wouldn't find a way to survive if the landscape in Nebraska weren't there. Do we really think that it's that critical, or are we preserving it for our own benefit? And this is, again, where we kind of can look at this species and this landscape as a way of humans creating an identity around them. And what exactly is that identity? Well, in a 2017 study by Doherty et al., they found that nearly 46,000 tourists came to see the sandhill cranes in 2017. Over 90% of those individuals were not from the central Nebraska area. So they're bringing tourists in from, if not the region, a broader area than that. The total revenue from tourism was about $14.3 million in 2017, with an additional almost $400,000 in tax revenue generated. So you can make an argument, I think a pretty good argument, that the identity is really based on tourism and the economic gain in the area. And furthermore, if we start thinking about this species and where it spends its nesting and winter grounds and how much further it disperses beyond Nebraska, we really should be thinking about the power dynamics at play when we're considering not just the local economy, but how that local economy is going to be influenced by either end of the nesting ground and breeding ground, either end of the territory of the sandhill crane. And so, again, kind of going through the internet trying to find a little bit more information on the sandhill cranes, I found this lovely image from Saskatchewan's tourism website, which is advertising hunting of sandhill cranes. And so we can see with something as wide-ranging as a bird species, the care and management strategies that we implement here are going to have influences in other locations. And those care and management strategies in those places are going to have implications here. So suddenly our identity surrounding this bird is incorporating a lot of other cultures, not just our own. And we can easily see how the identity that we create and the power dynamics that other populations create and then have playing off of each other can become really heavily intertwined. And significant practices in one space like Nebraska, where we're actively trying to conserve the landscape and protect the bird species and give them a place to nest or to rest while they're going on to the nesting grounds, can influence the successful hunting rate in Saskatchewan, and maybe even how hunting in Saskatchewan could then influence the tourism industry in Nebraska, depending on how many birds are removed. So this is, again, kind of nutshelling this for you guys. This is where anthropology can really help us in the conservation endeavors. It aids in identifying what's important, who is it important to, who are the players, and what are we seeking to achieve? Who is in play then, and what are they seeking to achieve? We can incorporate more than one voice into this conversation, and we can balance out the power dynamics once we know what all of those are, both the positive and the negative, right? The conservation winners and the conservation losers. And we can create identities that work for multiple groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be a win for one population or one culture or one person. It can be successful across many. We don't have to just select from a few. But we also are going to be well poised to explain decision-making processes to a broader audience, why this decision was arrived at and what benefit that it provides. And so we can kind of help start balancing both the local and the global futures that end up playing out in conservation here and abroad. And that's what I have for you guys. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We are going to launch a brief survey, like I mentioned at the beginning, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to fill it out. It'll only take less than a minute to complete, and it helps programming like this one. And so we can cater to your wants and your needs. And if you have any feedback, we greatly appreciate it. But if you could take the time to fill that out, and then we are going to transition to some questions. And so after you filled out the survey, you can put any questions you have in the chat to ask Dr. Sefczek yourself.
Need to figure out if I can open the chat. Here we go.
Um, I will start one off while people are um filling out the survey. My brain is like just still thinking about everything you said. I feel like it's hard to encounter. I just took 4 pages of notes, so bear with me a second. But that graph you showed, or the image, that was like the percentage of the extinct species in each
Yeah,
continent. And North
Sefczek.
America was definitely number one on that list. Is that mainly due to agriculture? And then if so, how have we escalated more than other continents?
It's not necessarily due specifically to agriculture. This is just kind of this is the one you were talking about, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is just an image showing kind of the loss of megafauna wherever human populations moved. And if you look at the top, it's 52,000 years BC to 9,000 years BC. Agriculture is somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years. So agriculture is going to be part of it, but not the whole thing. Um, no, it just in general, wherever human populations move, we are very, very good at again adjusting our environment to our fit our needs. Um, and whenever you do that, whenever you start changing the environment, it's going to change the ecological niche. So some species are going to be okay, some species might thrive, and some species might not. And this is just showing that megafauna in particular seem to not do very well whenever we started changing the environment.
If anyone has any questions, just reiterating that you can put them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we can answer them while we have Dr. Sefczek here with us. But,
I also kind of thought of a question, as other people maybe are thinking of questions too, but I thought it was really interesting how you brought up how many resources we've put into crane territory when they're a transient species. So that means we have the resources. So how do you think we could do like a mental shift of the people to try to like care about the species that are here year round?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I mean, and it's not even necessarily just how do we do that, but is that what we want to do, right? Because there is such a huge identity built around the sandhill cranes, and I don't think you're going to have success convincing people that it shouldn't be a focus. Um, so maybe it's a more a question of like sharing the resources a little bit better. But it's it's difficult because you just have to be able to generate some sort of emotional connection, right? And that's where, you know, the work in Madagascar that Dr. Lewis and Susie Lewis were doing with the local populations was it's so critical. And some of the things that a lot of conservation work around the world is doing is trying to build that connection so that people have more of a emotional attachment to their local species. You know, we one of my classes, again, we had I mentioned this to you both before. We had a couple of representatives from Nebraska Game and Parks come in and talk to us about the work that's being done around the Salt Creek tiger beetles, which are very much endemic to the area in Lincoln and are not going to be found anywhere else and are endangered. But you know, it's also a beetle, which a lot of people just have that kind of feeling towards insects is it's not warm and fuzzy sometimes. So it really sometimes is just generating some sort of connection for people that needs to happen first.
Yeah, that's totally true. I like that. It's good advice.
Easier said than done sometimes, though.
Yeah, but I mean, I definitely think that's why continuing environmental education and having events like this and having game and parks events and making sure people keep that connection is so important, especially
Absolutely.
in like the digital age. Like as we get more, people are more on their phones and more inside than they ever have been before. So yeah,
Yeah.
This was a really interesting presentation, so thanks for taking time to do it.
Oh, of
For
course.
sure. I have one more question, if just to wait a little bit more to see if anyone else thinks of any in the meantime, but you kind of touched on it at the end, but I think it's really interesting to think of humans as a part of nature, or like we usually think of ourselves as separate from nature.
Mhm.
I just like would love to get your thoughts on that and like how you view that, especially like with the work you do in Madagascar, or like how important you think it is to like shift our view of how we're connected to nature.
I mean, I'm trying to keep this talk positive. That's the
It's sometimes it's hard.
so my opinion, and again, this is not going to be a happy thought, but at some point we're gonna probably have to face a reality that we might not be able to save everything. If we want to be able to maintain a lifestyle that we have, um, and and keep ourselves comfortable, keep our species successful, which again, from like a biological perspective, that's the whole point of it, right? Um, I think we're going to have to recognize that there are just some species that are not going to be successful in the habitats, in the landscapes that we make. Um, and yeah, we can kind of conserve some spaces and try and preserve some spaces, but it still is going to be preservation in our image of what should be there, and not necessarily a real space. Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of nasty reality to think about, but that's sort of, again, I have my background in a preservation ethic. Um, that I did my undergrad in wildlife biology and conservation biology, and that's how I was taught. And this concept of humans as part of nature is only like 10, 12 years old at this point. Um, so it's still a relatively new thing, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it as well. But yeah, the more I kind of think within that perspective of we make the landscapes we want to see, um, there might have to be some hard choices down the road. And as much as that stinks, it also is sadly probably really true.
For sure. It's a very like harsh but complicated reality of
Yeah.
dealing with that. I could keep asking questions all night, but to be respectful of everyone's time, someone in the Q&A just said, very interesting. I appreciate the information and that very much food for thought. Thank you, which I highly agree with. So if we don't have any more questions, I think that concludes our webinar tonight. If you haven't gotten the chance to fill out the survey that was launched, I will reiterate how we would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. If you want to share this with someone who wasn't able to attend tonight, or if you want to watch it again, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube in the near future with all of our past webinars. Thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar and learning about anthropology and conservation, and most importantly, thank you to Dr. Tim Sefczek for this presentation and giving us your time and talent. Have a great rest of your night. Thank you
Thank you
again,
guys
Tim. That was
thank you all.
amazing.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.